recording and I can continue to chat with you all, but we'll let Don go ahead. All right, thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, and I'm so glad to get a chance to talk to Master Gardeners again. Sorry I'm not able to do this in person though, but because I always love the potlucks that you all do. It's great stuff. Anyway, I'm very glad to be able to talk to you all. I'm very impressed with the kinds of things that Master Gardeners study and then get to do later. It's definitely one of the really most kind of interesting and dynamic of the programs that Extension puts out. As Carla mentioned, I'm an entomologist and plant pathologist by training, predominantly entomology, insects, but also plant pathology. I got my bachelor's degree at University of Delaware in entomology and plant pathology, and did my master's at UT Knoxville back a few years ago, but I got my master's there, and then I went on and got my PhD at Auburn University in entomology. And so I've had some experience in this area, and especially in entomology, but as it relates to plant diseases as well. And so I've done some postdocs in Mississippi Delta and taught at Delta State before I came to Austin Peay to teach. I'm now in my 16th year at Austin Peay, and I teach a whole series of different courses that are related to pest management. One of them is plant pathology that's going to be offered next spring, a full course in plant pathology for credit, Agriculture 4440. I'm teaching economic entomology, sort of an integrated pest management insect class this semester to my students. Next fall, I'll teach weed science or applied weed science about weed control. And then in the spring, one of our adjunct professors is going to teach fruit and vegetable crops. Every other year, I teach tobacco and grain crops, and then every spring I teach forestry. So I was doing a lot of different classes that may be of interest to folks who are in sort of the gardener and other areas. One of the things that we will also have from time to time is a new course in greenhouse management that Billy Harper teaches. Probably we'll also do a landscaping course in a couple of semesters too. So a variety of different options at Austin Peay in agriculture, just for those who didn't know Austin Peay has an ag program. We also have a farm that is just 3 miles from campus that allows us to do a lot of hands-on teaching activities. And in fact, we were able to graduate the second highest class of agriculture graduates this last year because we were able to do a lot of hands-on. When everybody was going strictly online, we were able to do things at the farm, and be able to at least see each other and those sort of things. So anyway, a lot of different opportunities, but today we're going to be focusing on plant pathology. You've been through all these other things. Some ways that does help prepare you for the really complex study of plant pathology. There's a lot of things that are involved with it. We're going to get into that. Let's see, how do I'm trying to change my slides here, but it doesn't. There we go. Okay, so with plant, this comes from a talk from my colleague Steve Bost from UT and Alan Wyndham, both plant pathologists from University of Tennessee System and Extension. And so we're going to be talking, and so the framework of that is this. I've kind of adjusted it a little bit, but mainly these are some of the basic things that Extension looked at for Master Gardeners before. There is a more updated version that Carla told me about, although I could not access it through my system, but yeah, I think it's available to Master Gardeners. But anyway, we're going to look at plant diseases. These really are very important things and can cause some really significant and sometimes rapid problems in agriculture and production. They can reduce the supply of food, fiber, timber, detract from plant beauty, obviously, at certain times in gardens and places like that. They cost a lot of money sometimes. Some of the damage that they inflict and the cost to control them are pretty high. And the cost of replanting are issues, and certainly price increase for consumers. Now, for plant pathologists, that means many times job security, but that we've had plant diseases for a long time, and we have to manage them rather than necessarily eradicate them. That's kind of the philosophy when it comes to pest management. So we're going to look at the basics of plant pathology today, talk about examples of diseases from each of the major disease pathogen types, talk about what disorders are in plants, and kind of touch on the art of plant diagnostics. some things that Carla actually has a lot of good access to through the extension plant pathology section. We'll talk about that at the end. So before I begin, are there any questions anybody has? Where are you going? Okay, well, all right. So we're going to look at some of the basics here of plant pathology. And I'm trying to, there we go. Okay, so what is a plant disease? So there are a lot of different things that people can sometimes classify as diseases. And many plant pathologists consider sort of abnormal plant conditions to be a disease. However, it's difficult for most people to picture abnormalities such as frost damage or insect damage as diseases. So we're going to be classifying and identifying it in a certain way. There are a couple of different things. Some are abiotic, non-biological disorders of plants caused by non-living agents, chemicals, weather, mechanical issues, environmental conditions, nutritional problems. Then there are the ones that really can get in and cause some significant damage, biological disease, disease-causing organisms and agents. So diseases that damage caused by organisms, often they're microscopic, and they form this sustained relationship. It's not good for the plant. It's a relationship that's bad for the plant, but they end up, but they continue to feed on those plants or absorb their energy. Pests like insects and other animals that feed on or otherwise damage plants can vector diseases. So we'll kind of address some of that too. Passing the test to be called disease, there are three basic requirements that plant pathologists look at. One of those is to have plant damage. We've seen some of these before, I'm sure, caused by an organism. That just eliminates abiotic situations. And they're in a sustained relationship. And so in essence, that eliminates insect and mammal. So this means organisms that are continuously feeding or absorbing or impacting that plant. So there's a few definitions at the outset that you're going to hear. You may have heard the term parasite. In that case, it's an organism that obtains its nutrients from another organism. It's feeding off of or absorbing off of that. A pathogen is a parasite that causes plant disease by disturbing the normal life process, the metabolic processes of the plant. The things that help it grow, this can shut that down, shut down reproduction, all sorts of things. So parasite, pathogen. Then there's also saprophytes. These are organisms that live off of dead organic matter, the eaters of the dead, that sometimes can reach out and beat up on your little baby plants, I guess they say sometimes. So some plant pathologists some plant pathogens can live as saprophytes for part of their life cycle, feeding on organic matter. Then all of a sudden, when you put those little fresh plants in, they're going to damp them off or damage them or destroy them. So there's a couple of different categories in here. One thing that is important is to distinguish between a disease and a disorder. And so there's a lot of different things that are abiotic, non-biological, that cause problems with plants. These disorders, any kind of injury not caused by an organism. So if you've got too low of a pH, around here we have a lot of that from time to time, it's too acidic, or if it's too alkaline, that can be a problem for several reasons. One, it can rob the nutrients. Sometimes it can actually toxify the soil itself, but pH can be a problem. Water is always a problem if there's too little, because it's going to be a wilt, and it's too much. That's not a disease, that's just lack of that vital component. Temperatures are, other factors, environmental, too high, too low, that can be an issue. And then there's a whole bunch of nutritional deficiencies that, I don't know, Carla, if you all went over any of those, but you can tell when certain plants start going through a yellowing process, stunting, that there's some nutritional deficiencies. They're purpling at times. That can be the effect of the lack of phosphorus and things like that. Again, those are not necessarily diseases, but they're disorders or deficiencies and things like that. Other times you can get some very intense fertilizers that can cause some kind of acidic or burn reaction, particularly to young tender vegetation. If you have too much of something like that goes on, that's not a disease, it's a disorder. Pesticide burns, boy, that can be an issue. In recent years, we've had some problems with spray drift from various herbicides that had rather volatile. Things like dicamba have unfortunately been able to spread sometimes from fields, causing problems with adjacent fields and things like that. Again, it's not a disease, that's obviously herbicides. Air pollution is also an issue. Sometimes you'll hear about ozone warnings down in the Nashville Basin. Occasionally we'll get that, or air quality. Sometimes that can cause some problems with plants as well and show impacts. Again, not a disease. And then finally, mechanical injury, things like weed whacker blight. You know, sometimes somebody's trying to trim around a tree and they hit the cambium of the tree. That can be a big problem. So anyway, there's a variety of different disorders, but they're not diseases per se. A disease in this case, it's an actual process in plants. And this is most likely something you're going to see on your tests, quizzes, whatever you're going to do in Master Gardener, this plant disease triangle. This is sort of a classic concept of plant pathology. Basically, a biological plant disease requires the interaction of three basic things: a host that's susceptible to whatever pathogen there might be. It may not have the right protections or things like that, whether it's by genetic or other environmental conditions, but susceptible host, a virulent pathogen, one that can reach out and infect and invade the plant. And then favorable environments. All those three things have to be together for a disease to happen and continue. And so this is a dynamic process. Many times, once all those conditions are right, that disease can spread rapidly throughout a field or a series of plants or crops. If you can find a way to stop one or more of those components of that triangle, that's a way for management. We'll talk about it a little bit later. The plant disease triangle, susceptible host, virulent pathogen, favorable environment. All that stuff kind of makes sense. All those three have to be present and favorable for disease to occur. And so that brings us to these living organisms or components that cause diseases in plants. And the major types that we're going to talk about include fungi, which is really one of the most important groups of organisms that cause these diseases. You can see the fungi in this image next to a plant cell that we see up here. That the fungi are actually pretty large cells that kind of push their way in and invade and absorb nutrients of plant cells. Then there are bacteria, and they're much smaller. They tend to be a lot smaller prokaryotes that can cause some real issues with plants and plant diseases. Then viruses, which are even smaller still and not exactly self-sustaining organisms, but they certainly can get in and wreak havoc to plants' genetic framework and damage plants that way. And then finally, there's an animal that's actually a worm, nematodes, that cause things that are very similar to plant diseases. They tend to be microscopic. That's why they tend to be grouped in with plant pathogens. So fungi, bacteria, viruses, nematodes, these are all particular issues with of living organisms that can cause plant diseases. And so we'll look at some of the types of diseases and their symptoms. There's a lot of different terms that you may hear. A lot of these are good old English words like rot and blight and galls and root knots and wilt. All those things are people have known for a long time in agricultural societies. And so they stick with our language. Cankers too as well. All of these things are terms that describe some kind of plant disease, many times caused by an organism. One of the most famous one that everybody at least has some familiarity with is the Irish, the thing that caused the Irish potato famine, the potato late blight. It's actually not truly a fungus. It's a thing called a water mold that acts like a fungus and can be controlled sometimes like a fungus, but Phytophthora infestans. It wreaked havoc in parts of Ireland and parts of Northern Europe and other parts of the world, and still is a disease problem that we have to deal with. But it was such a bad disease that it took a large portion of the population of Ireland, partially because of the economic system that they were under the oppression of the English land tenure system that they had. whatever that combination was, this can cause some significant problems. It has in history, continues to be an issue there. Another really infamous disease that took one of the most important forest trees in the eastern United States was chestnut blight. This was a fungal parasite that got out in the Brooklyn Botanical Garden in some Asian chestnut tree plantings that were there, and spread from the early 1900s. And by the middle of the 1900s, it had killed the vast majority of chestnut trees. And this was no mean feat. The forests of the eastern United States were considered chestnut oak forests, oak chestnut forests. It was a very, very resilient wood, grew very large, had insect resistant properties, all these great things, lots of things. If you've ever been to Cades Cove, you'll see a bunch of fences and other cabins that were built with that old chestnut wood. But this fungus got out there, Cryphonectria parasitica, and just about wiped every one of those trees out. Fortunately, we've had some that have grown back from rootstock that we've been able to help to crossbreed and get some resistance. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But these diseases can have major impact on human civilization societies. We're no longer the oak chestnut forest in the eastern United States, but the oak hickory forest. Another one you may have heard of is the Dutch elm disease, which is Ceratocystis olmii. This is a fungus that was carried on the piggyback of an insect, along with some old wood that was brought over from World War I trenches. And it got out in Ohio and spread and killed many of the great graceful American elms. 40 million trees killed worldwide, et cetera. There are some resistant trees that are being developed, but it, again, a plant disease that took out a very important architectural tree, a very important ornamental tree as well. So fungi themselves, each of those situations we're dealing with fungi or a water mold that's related to those. So with these fungi, we're talking about organisms that they have their own complexity. We may just think of them as mushrooms, but there's a lot of other types of fungi, and particularly the plant pathogens are that way. These are many times slender thread-like organisms that build cell upon cell, these very, very fine hair-like structures that make sometimes some very important infestive masses that can cause issues with plants. They require external food sources. They're different from plants. They used to be lumped with plants, but they don't produce their own food. They have to absorb it from plants and things like that. Many times these are commonly called molds, or rusts, rots, or things like that. There are a whole series of those, and smuts, that's another one that an old term for certain fungi. What they are is produced by these long thread-like series of cells that are called hyphae, and they make a mycelium, a mass. This is a mycelium of Rhizoctonia, a very common soil-borne pathogen in turf. But you can see they're rather slender, and they kind of grow and then add to each other. And as they do, they find places to absorb nutrients, whether that's from organic matter or from plants. Unfortunately, they'll hit living plants too. If you look at these microscopically, that's how you have to see a lot of these structures. There's some pretty amazing reproductive structures they have. They have the complete capacity to go through a sexual reproduction, but they can also go through asexual reproduction. So it means they have the ability to develop the genetics that can help them overcome fungicides, but they can also rapidly reproduce asexually and take over places fast. So a lot of different kinds of interesting structures that you can learn more about, but basically many of these are microscopic. Some of them, though, you can actually see the fruiting bodies of the fungi, in this case, black rot of grapes. So this is obviously some pretty damaged grapes at this stage of the game. These fungi are kind of taking over and absorbing all that rich nutrient resource that the grapes were producing there. But the thing about them is they actually have a true physical fungal body that you can see in this case. Therefore, it's a sign that you can actually see on the plant. Some others that you might see if you ever go to the grocery store and see some kind of rotten fruit or things like that. They may have some things like gray mold or other things like that, or brown mold on certain fruits. Most of the time, the produce section is always cycling their produce through, so you don't see this. But I worked in produce when I was in college and stuff, and you can find places where you can see some of these signs of those. Lots of spores coming out, sporulating on this fruit. Taking it from a fresh strawberry, starting to really absorb that sweet nutrient, and then eventually taking it all over and drying it out almost. Others, though, put this kind of fine powdery series of their structures all across the leaves. A lot of times you see this in pumpkins in the late summer and fall, powdery mildew, this kind of dusty looking kind of whitish stuff all over the plant. That's actually a whole series of fungal hyphae and spores that are over that surface of the plant. That's on a crepe myrtle in this case, but I tend to see them a lot in pumpkins or cucurbits kind of later in the season. Others, there's another type of mildew that is a downy mildew, and that's a different kind of fungal-like organism that will attack this butternut squash. Usually you can't see the actual downy mildews with the naked eye, whereas this stuff, you're at this stuff with the powdery mildew, you're seeing actual fungal structures on the surface, true signs in that case. Let's see. Some fungi are really easy to see. We always think of mushrooms, we think of fungi. And this is a fairy ring of turf that the olden times people used to think that was where the fairies would have their conventions at night, those are things. But the truth is, what this is a fungal infestation that may have started in this turf in a center, then year by year it grew out in concentric rings to now where all of these fungal reproductive structures, the mushrooms, come out in a ring. And next year it'll probably be a little bit wider. I tend to see these kind of in August when we get a lot of humidity, and if we get some rain and things like that, some kind of hot humidity in that sort of time, we get these fairy rings of turf grass. Fungi in this case. There's the above parts and the undersides that have the gills. Keep in mind, fungi in the form of mushrooms can sometimes be difficult to identify. And sometimes that can cost people dearly if they eat the wrong things. There are a series of mushrooms that have some very potent toxins that sometimes damage or destroy livers of people who eat them. So you have to be careful. I don't know that fairy ring is that kind of damaging or devastating, but there are some fungi out there, and you really do need to have a level of expertise to be able to identify these properly. Or else, there are some significant consequences that in the medical literature. All right, other fungi that are easy to diagnose, I always look for each year when we get true smut on corn. This is Ustilago matus. It's a fungus that will basically infest the silks of corn early in the season when it's silking, and then turn that, what would have been a corn kernel, into a mushroom of a type on the corn. It looks awful. When you break it open, it's these black spores that are really nasty looking. And the only word in Old English, I guess, for it was smut, the true word for that in the English language. However, it is not toxic the way other mushrooms are. It is actually can be used as a food of all things. In Mexico, it's a delicacy. They call it huitlacoche. You can see in this little can over here, it's something that they can actually seek out. You can cook fritters out of this corn smut, off of corn. This is a smut also growing off of a stem of corn, the Austin Peay Victory Garden. Anyway, but that's a smut. That's an easy one to identify. Another type of fungi that a lot of people probably see are these shelf fungi or Ganoderma conchs. They're basically something that's growing on a tree that's either dying or is in the process of dying, and those sorts of things. Sometimes they're dead trees too. Basically taking that nutrient resource and absorbing it and producing a billion spores at times. So the world of fungi can be rather bizarre. I like to spend some time on it. My students learn about the different groups, but we'll probably move on. There are a few other types that are called rusts because they produce reddish spores at a certain stage in their life cycle. And some of those can really be devastating. Let's see, I've got one here. I don't know if we're going to be able to see it. Probably not. This is one that's called wheat stem rust, and it's responsible for a lot of damage to wheat all around the world where wheat is grown. It produces these late in the season, it produces these black spores along the stems, but at a certain stage of its life, it produces reddish spores, and why they call it rust. And so you can have it on grasses, you can have it on beans, it can be on geraniums. There's several different kinds of rust fungi. Those are relatively easy to see. So there's another rust that I think some of you may have actually seen. Anybody ever seen this one, this cedar apple rust? It's something that grows on cedar trees. It produces these strange nodules on there, doll-like structures that will, in the spring will grow out these crazy orange tentacles that put out a lot of spores. And those will travel later in the spring to early summer onto apple trees. So it starts out with cedar in one form, spreads to apples or hawthorn, and can cause this discoloration and disfigurement and that sort of thing, or to the leaves, some kinds of lesions and things like that. Anyway, but that's cedar apple rust because of the sometimes a reddish type of spores that they produce. Whoops. So anyway, that's cedar apple rust. I think those are the best illustrations I can show. Then there are some things that aren't actually fungi. And so they get sometimes lumped to that because they look like it. But every once in a while, if somebody gets a fresh load of mulch, that kind of forest tree mulch or something like that, you get this really weird growth on it that some people say looks like dog vomit. They call it the dog vomit slime mold. It's actually a slime mold, which is a very different organism from a fungus. And mostly they're just feeding off the nutrients that are on the mulch. Another one is Physarum slime mold. There's Untal fescue. It's mostly feeding on stuff that's on the plant rather than damaging the plant when it comes to that. Some other times you've got things like these lichens down below. I don't know why the labels didn't show up on them, at least in my slide, but lichens are something different. It's a combination of a fungus that lives with an algae, and they kind of produce this symbiotic organism. But anyway, those aren't fungi per se. They are different types of organisms that mostly are benign or not really causing significant damage like some fungi can. Slime molds, okay. And then lichens, there's lichens. Sorry, about that. So those are things that look like that. Now, one of the things that we want to also talk about is the kinds of damage that can be caused by fungal-like organisms or fungi. This is an example of sooty blotch and fly speck on apple. Sometimes these are things that are classed as cosmetic diseases. They don't necessarily destroy the actual fruit, but they discolor it and make it not very marketable, because most people, if they see this, are probably not going to purchase that at the local grocery store. This might be something that gets made in applesauce or things like that, or maybe not, but it just depends. They're not toxic, but this is rather hard to market to consumers. And so producers want to prevent stuff like this from happening to their fruits. Okay, so other kinds of things that these fungi can do is produce symptoms on the plants. And so some of those symptoms could include chlorosis. Sometimes that can be nutritional, but sometimes fungi can produce this depletion of nutrients and a yellowing of plants. Various poorly drained sites can also have this problem caused by yellowing, root rots, or kind of nutrient deficiency. But it can also be done by root rots that are actually infecting the roots of the plant and causing this rather poor peaked yellow kind of growth. Chlorosis meaning yellowing in that case. Other times we can see fungal evidence by leaf spots, chlorosis and necrosis. So chlorosis is a yellowing first, then eventually necros, meaning death, killing parts of that plant, or the plant sacrificing parts of itself to keep the fungi from spreading. So there's a whole series of these: alternaria leaf spot, that's on cantaloupe, early blight of tomato. You can see that in a variety of tomato fields. Black spots of roses. Oh my goodness, that's a mess. There's a series of different things that can be done for those. But these can be initially started as chlorosis, yellowing of the tissues, and then necrosis, kind of blackening and dying off of the tissues. Also, these leaf spots can go even further than that. They can start out as these kind of roundish lesions, depending on what that is. That's anthracnose of dogwood there. This is a type of entomosporium leaf spot on Photina. And sometimes that will start yellowing and then darkening, and then eventually just wiping out that part of the plant, making these shot holes in the leaves. All right, so those are some other kinds of symptoms. There are also some issues that you can get with leaf spot shapes on plants. This is a downy mildew of cucumber doing what looks kind of like a mosaic pattern. There's a different kind of mosaic that viruses do, but this is actually caused by a fungus in cucumbers. And in this case, there's a downy mildew on a pumpkin. So the powdery mildew we talked about would be that fine white powdery looking fungal structures on there. The downy mildew is different. It tends to infect in the leaf. Sometimes it will eject spores out of the stomata, little holes in the bottom. But anyway, that's a leaf spot that will start out roundish to angular or even mosaic in this case. Let's see. So other kinds of things, they call this term anthracnose, is used for a lot of different diseases. This is one from dogwood that has been an issue over the last several decades, discula fungus, that causes these kind of strange oblong lesions. Let's see if I can, too irregular in shape. There's one that is late blight of tomato. That's the one that caused the Irish potato famine, with strange sort of lesions on that. Early blight, these concentric rings. The plant initially got infected, it kind of walled it off and spread in that way. I've seen some of this on English ivy as well, these sort of anthracnose looking, strange looking lesions on the leaves. Let's see, pull this here. Okay, good. Now, so we talk about some of these symptoms: chlorosis, necrosis, leaf spots. There's also this term that we use called blight. And that can be, blights can be in fungal plants or fungal diseases attacking plants, or they can also be bacterial. So the term blight is an old word that's used for something that causes a rapid death of the foliage. And so sometimes that happens with early blight on tomato. If that gets in there, it can take out whole plants in a relatively short time, unfortunately. Late blight on tomato can also do this, causing some, again, a whole blighting of the entire plant. This is a blight on a downy mildew on cucurbits, causing a blight-like death to these. The cucurbits in the back have a resistant variety. So it ends up being important to be able to choose blight resistant or wilt resistant types of plants. And you can buy that in the seed pack sometimes. It'll say it on the seed pack. So anyway, blights are, unfortunately, some things that can get to some types of plants quickly. Let's see. There are also dieback blights. I've seen this happen a lot, even in recent years. There's a type of dieback that's happened in crepe myrtles, and I'm not sure that's exactly related to this, but there are things like this dogwood anthracnose where you still got leaves growing on the plant, but some of those sections just basically killed off sections of it. And that's a type of blight that's caused by a fungus. This one over here is called fire blight. And so that's one that's actually very common in orchards and other types of things like that. So there are certain bacterial diseases that will take the tips of these trees and then kind of work their way down. But that's from a bacteria as opposed to a fungus. Also, turf grass gets blights. There's a Rhizoctonia brown patch in fescue grass. It tends to be in grass that's very thickly seeded with long wet periods, maybe some thatching and too much fertilizer. Some folks will say, well, you could fertilize your lawn and it'd be, it would grow faster. And I'm like, then I'd have to cut it faster and I might get a blight, or something like this. That's not necessarily the thing that folks in the turf industry want to hear, but so let me make sure I say that. So the key is sometimes if it's too thick with too much fertilizer, it can cause conditions that favor this fungus to take over and cause a blight. So just the right amount of fertilizer is the way to go. Not too much wetness, but of course not too dry. It's tough to do turf sometimes, but that's a blight that can be an issue that can take these patches of turf. Okay, another type of thing that you find on plants, in addition to the leaf spots and blights, are stem lesions. That is, the stem itself gets a lesion that can sometimes start to sink into it, sink the tissue, damaging it, darkening it, killing it. They can also completely damp the whole thing off and kill it off around that way. A localized area of diseased tissue that can sometimes grow around it and kill everything above it. So root rots can sometimes do this. If you get certain plants that are in way too wet a soil and they have a certain type of water mold or thing in it, they can cause an issue. Phytophthora is particularly notorious for this. It can be saprophytic, feeding on organic matter, and then boom, hit these roots. Pythium can do that as well. There's a root rot. Basically, it starts rotting the roots out. The upper parts of the plant starts kind of wilting, yellowing, those sorts of things. But it's softened, discolored tissue that's happening down below. Let's see. Then there's black root rots in pansy. So a nice fresh pansy in a seedling transplant might look like this. This looks a little root bound, but this is one where the actual roots have been killed or killed off by a root rot in that case. And that happens in several different places. Sometimes when people try to plant various evergreens in particularly pines or certain types of cedars or things down in wet areas, it's usually pretty bad for those plants. And many of those can tend to die off. So anyway, but root rots can be an issue that are fungal related. Some of them also cause this damping off, a seedling disease caused by several soil-borne fungi, Rhizoctonia, Pythium, and Fusarium. These can cause the damage to the most tender of the little baby plants that are starting to try to grow up. Also, they're a problem in some of the greenhouses that are trying to produce float bed plants, sometimes tobacco, sometimes other kinds of float bed plants. If you get damping off in there, it can spread quick and they have to act quickly on those. These are fungi or fungal-like organisms, the water molds that are that can do this. This is a Pythium disease in snap beans, and you can see started out, that's a relatively healthy plant, but there's the beginnings of it, sort of an extended damage to that and a completely damping off of that snap beans. And those plants aren't going to do much once all that xylem and phloem is destroyed in those plants. Pythium, Rhizoctonia, these are common types of things that might be in the soil that can dampen off your little seedlings. Sometimes a seed treatment can make a big difference in this case, to give that little plant a chance to grow and prevent the water mold or fungus from getting it, and then it can grow up. If it gets big enough, many times it can overcome that. But when they're fresh and tender, that can really be a particular weak spot for these plants. All right, so yeah, here's a seed treatment. So I knew I was coming up on that. So seed treatment can be done in many different ways. Some of these, there are actually organic types of seed treatment. There are others that are, chemical pesticides, basically fungicides that can treat the seeds. Sometimes they'll have a coloration, like some of them will have this pinkish color on the seeds. Many times if you buy seeds at the co-op, they have a seed treatment. They'll be treated in pink or sometimes a green coloration. It means they've been treated to protect them from these diseases. That way, the little seeds, when they get a start, can grow up and escape, the potential root rots that could hit them. Okay, so that's a whole series of different fungal symptoms that might happen. There are some other things that you may see, these fruit lesions and rots, obviously things that are not very marketable at a grocery store or a fruit stand. There's anthracnose on strawberry, white rot lesions on apple, and brown rot on peaches. These are pretty, severe and obviously going to affect and impact the marketability of those crops. But basically, these fungi are getting in there. Once they can get into that system, they can absorb all those nutrients and then move on to the next cell and kind of do the same thing over and over again. One other type of lesions that there are these sunken lesions. I mentioned the chestnut blight. That's a classic case of where much of the tree at a certain stage of it has this fungal infection that causes the living tissue of the tree to be infected by it, and everything above it is basically killed off. So you get a sunken lesion in this case, and all that above ground portion of that plant is going to wilt and die because it's stifling any of the nutrients or phloem from moving. Sometimes there's a papery bark with that. This is a dogwood anthracnose, pretty severe dogwood anthracnose. The tree's trying to grow around it, but it's pretty serious what's happened to that, and it's certainly going to severely weaken that tree, if not kill it. So it's another term that fungal bodies can do, cause these sunken lesions. And then wilts. That is something that we can see not just happening from the lack of water, many times from fungi that will get into the plant and take over the vascular tissue, choking it off, wilting off everything above it and causing it to shrink, wilt, and eventually die. That's the symptoms of it here. Then over here where the arrow is are the actual signs. This is a Sclerotium ralphsii, causing this damage to the tree or to this plant. There's also some of these fungi that'll directly clog up part of the vascular tissue, the xylem or phloem, and that causes another wilt disease. So this is verticillium wilt. There's fusarium wilt. Sometimes you can see VF wilt resistant when you buy seeds. That means that variety has resistance to those particular wilting diseases. And so you can see that sapwood, it's going to kill many of the plant parts that are above it from that wilt. There's a fusarium wilt I mentioned before. That's in some tomatoes, causing chlorosis and death above. Basically, it's taken over the vascular tissues, clogged them up, shut it down above. Wilting is not as big a symptom, but it's something that sort of weakens the plant. But a resistant variety many times is one of the best choices to stop that in areas where this wilts occur. Okay. So those are a whole series of symptoms and even signs, the wilting. Now, there are sometimes when you can get witch's brooms or galls or things like that, strange bunchy growths of these plants. And many of you have seen things like this. Sometimes it happens as rosettes or witch's brooms. Instead of a healthy plant like this blackberry here, this one produces a whole bunch of rather deformed components that would have been fruits, but they're really pretty poorly formed by whatever that disease has caused. So in some cases, that's a fungal situation. In other cases, that may be done by viruses. There's also stunting in plants. So if you've got tomato spotted wilt virus, they can cause plants to grow very, very stunted, not grow like in its typical healthy shape, producing a good architecture for growing fruit. In these cases, these tomatoes are damaged by a virus. In this case, it's by a nematode, which we don't tend to have as much of here in like root knot nematode is more in sandy soils, but we do have some nematodes. Let's see. Other things are called galls. All the gall. I guess that galls are these round nodule type growths that you may have. Sometimes they're on leaves, sometimes they're on stems. I have one here that sometimes folks will call a burl. but that is a type of gall that grew on this, I guess this is a beech tree stem, causing this kind of strange growth that you can see, I guess, in my little image here. Anyway, there's a whole series of those types of galls. Fungal galls can produce things like that. And also knots, sort of knot-like structures. This is on plums. And basically, if you get some things like that, it's important to try to prune some of those things out to prevent it from spreading further or spreading spores to infest the rest of the trees in the area. Let's see. Anthracnose diseases sometimes cause a whole series of things. Most types of those plants will have a type of quote unquote anthracnose. Each of those is caused by a different fungus. Fortunately, many times they're specific, so they're not going to spread from one species that's completely different from another. So the good news is that certain oak anthracnose won't get oak anthracnose from something that's infecting strawberry. Sometimes that's not the case, but in some cases that is the case with anthracnose. All right. So goodness gracious, it's been just about an hour and we've just talked about the fungi. Now, one of the reasons we spend time talking about fungi is because they're probably one of the most critical and important diseases of plants. Bacteria and some of the others cause issues, but I wanted to spend a little time on that. It looks as though I've got a question in the chat. Okay, so there's something due to strong windstorms causing lots of tree falls, breaking up rooting in local area. Parks and Rec have anyone checking periodically for tree or plant diseases? Well, there's a person in your class that gets a lot of calls to check on those plants. Carla, can you answer something about that, about the kinds of things that you do or the network of folks that may look for these things?
Yes, we have a city forester, Katie Killebrew, and she actually taught our woody ornamentals class. And so we kind of divide things up when we get tree calls. So if it's in the city limits, and they call me, we'll contact Katie and either we'll go together or she'll go take care of it. If it's in the county, that's my job to go take care of it. So anything that has to do with the city Parks and Rec would be through the city forester. So if you see a tree that's down in a park or something like that, you might want to just give them a call and let them know, because we do have a lot of parks, but we do have a city forester.
Good thing about having master gardeners are they're kind of deputized in a way to be some of the first sentinels to spot some of this stuff. Many times they know what they're looking at, or they hear from somebody that asked them a question. And I'm very impressed with some of the things that master gardeners have been able to catch before they get too far out of hand. All right, so how are we going to do this? So we're going to move into some of the other causal organisms. We're going to bacteria next. Do we need a break at this point, or are we okay to keep going at this point?
Nope.
Ready to go? Okay, good. All right, we'll go on. So
keep moving.
So we talked about fungi. The next group we're going to talk about are bacteria. And these are in many ways very different from fungi because they're so small and they reproduce very rapidly. But one of the keys about them is they've got to have a lot of moisture, water, those sorts of things in order for things to happen like that. And so we're going to deal with bacteria. So they're pretty teeny tiny. Single-celled organisms, they don't have their own nuclei. They produce rapidly by cell division. Ask anybody that left chicken salad out too long, how soon that, if you have a nice picnic, that can ruin it. That happened with I remember the first time that happened was with my father and his friends from work had a picnic and somebody had chicken that got bad, and boy, everybody paid the price on that. They're rapid reproducers and they like, warm, moist environments many times to reproduce pretty rapidly. These bacteria that we're dealing with plant pathogens don't produce spores. There are some bacteria that can sporulate, but not these. They can reproduce rapidly and spread with whatever moisture. Sometimes just raindrops can spatter bacteria from one plant leaf to another or plant stems to others. a lot of times you find when there's been a lot of rain spattering, bacterial spots can be flecking all where those little raindrops go, because bacteria themselves can't travel fast. They can kind of move a little bit, but that's what they sometimes rely on as a water source. There's a lot of different kinds of symptoms associated with bacteria, including leaf spots, blights, things we've heard before from fungi, but in different species causing those symptoms. Soft rots, that's some pretty nasty stuff. When you get a bunch of potatoes and one of them is really stinking and nasty and rotten. Then there's vascular wilts caused by bacterium, galls that are formed by bacterium, and cankers. So yay, all those great terms. Anyway, but that's, again, you see some of the same names of things, but caused by a different organism. So fire blight is a term that was used. I mentioned it before. It's a bacterium that causes damage to the shoots and tips of this plant. They'll start out with that. That bacterium will burn it out, like destroy that part of that plant and basically turn it kind of dark brown and kill and dry it out. This is a blossom blight that's damaged to certain apples, things like that. Fruit trees can get some of these quickly. Galls. These are some pretty amazing things. The bacteria that do this are called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. Tumor is in the name of it. And so you can see it that many times they'll set up shop in the stem of the plant or a portion of the plant, and then they go crazy. They force the plant to grow crazy, bizarre structures that produce lots of sugar for them and crazy growths and things like that. They're sucking the nutrients out of that plant and forcing it to grow that way by altering the plant's growth. So it's quite a thing that this parasite does. This is a crown gall of Euonymus. It's really ugly looking and not very marketable. The plant can survive above it, but it seriously reduces its ability and certainly marketability and certainly its cosmetic damage properties. So galls are an issue there. I showed one gall here, this I think is a fungal gall. I'm sorry, I don't have it close enough, but this one is a gall on olives, but that's a bacterial gall at the base of that stem. Not really easy to show here, but sorry, I don't have this in person. But anyway, galls are a thing that bacteria do. They can do leaf spots as well. Sometimes there are these little teeny tiny flecks starting out in some parts, many times the lower parts of the plant where the raindrops have splashed it. There is a bacterial spot of tomato. There's one on peppers. It's a little bit more advanced in that case, but a bacterium causing it this time. And it's important to know the difference between those because what you use to control a fungus may be different from what you use to control a bacterium. In commercial agriculture, they use fungicides to control fungi, and they sometimes have to use a type of antibiotic to control bacteria because that's we use antibiotics against bacteria inside of us. It can be used all at some expense for controlling some of the bacterial spots. There's bacterial spot of English ivy. So you may have seen this kind of spotting, on English ivy. Again, English ivy is an invasive exotic species, just for everybody to know. So it's not always a bad thing to have that happen, but if you've got it over your house and get this, it's not very beautiful. There's bacterial shot hole disease on a laurel. And so basically what's happened is the bacterium started infecting it, killing off part of that plant. And the plant basically cut that part of it loose. It bore a hole or a shot hole in the plant itself. Sometimes you also get bacterial scorch, in this case of oak. This one is one that can be vectored by a little plant hopper, but you're basically seeing the bacterium is killing parts of the external part of the leaf. The part that's still living is along the veins of the plant, but that's seriously damaging that plant. If it happens early enough in the season, it can kill off a plant or force it to have some serious consequences. Other things that happen with bacteria are wilts. And so this is a type of wilt. We talked about some with fungi that can clog up. Certain bacteria can clog up the xylem and phloem and prevent nutrients and water getting up to other parts of the plant, and the resulting thing is that these plants will wilt and die. When you cut that stem, you can see this matrix the bacteria live in that kind of drips apart, kind of pulls apart as you pull that part of the leaf. Basically, all that stuff's gumming up the vascular system of the plant, killing it off above. All right. So there's a lot of different diseases that are bacterial. This is just a few of them. But we spent a little less time talking about bacteria than we do fungi, because tend to be more diseases and disease complexes with fungi. That doesn't mean bacteria can't be devastating. This would be, pretty much the end of the line for some of these cucurbits out in the field, whether it's melons or whatever that is. Certain bacteria can cause some real significant problems. So we've got fungi, bacteria, and then viruses. These are bizarre types of things, and we're unfortunately so familiar with certain types of viruses these days. With plants, they get viruses too. Many of them are specific to them, but these are submicroscopic agents that you mostly cannot see unless you've got very, very high-powered microscopes. Usually it's electron microscopy that sees this. Very, very small particles that aren't living themselves, but can take over the living resources of that cell and the genetics of it and force it to grow crazily, and then basically make copies of itself, reproduce rapidly, and cause sometimes death of plants. So it's a type of DNA or RNA covered by a protein code. It's very, very simple. All it has to do is get into that plant somehow or other through a wound or an injury or by an insect feeding on it, and then it can take over in some of those cells and just rapidly reproduce and spread. They can cause some rather unique structures like necrotic spot virus symptoms. This is necrotic spots on impatiens. And so it starts out, as a central infestation and then kind of spreads. Sometimes the plant will rally and be able to kind of fight it off, but then it kind of the fungus regroup or the virus regroups and spreads. It kind of depends on, what the plant and its health stage and those things. But this is what happens when you have a viral necrotic spot system. Others cause spotted wilt virus in tomatoes and things like that. This is spotted wilt virus in tomatoes, wilting the leaves, also causing trouble in the fruits. This is not it's a very multicolored fruit, but it's not a very marketable tomato when it comes to something like that. Incidentally, there's some varieties of tulips that basically got this amazing color pattern from viruses, and they will go for some very high price, even if they've got this virus, because they're ornamental. They can still grow, but they produce this kind of interesting, bizarre color pattern. But that's something similar to this. This is obviously damaging to tomatoes and other crops. Then there's the true mosaic virus disease syndrome or symptomatology. This is a bean yellow mosaic. Basically, there's a pattern of mosaicked sections that the viruses basically take over the cells in that little section of the plant. In this case, in this section of the net venation, basically making lots of copies themselves, preventing the plant from producing nice green sections, not having a lot of chloroplasts, so you get these yellowing spots or mosaics. Sometimes they can also wilt part of the plants or cause it to have these kind of puckering looking structures on it. But viruses, that's tobacco mosaic virus on a tomato plant. They also cause trouble in tobacco. But these viruses, can cause problems, especially if you've got plants that don't have a resistance to them. Many times you can buy seeds that have resistance to tobacco mosaic virus or other types of mosaic viruses. They're intermingled patches of light, dark green tissue. There's tobacco mosaic virus, and then puckering and things like that. The fruits will have a very spotting. That's on squash there. In this case, it's an aphid transmitted disease, a little tiny insect that has that proboscis, that kind of sucking straw tube that when it feeds into the plant, it has to spit up just a little bit. It puts saliva into the plant and then sucks it back up. A little gross to think about. Anyway, but the thing about that is sometimes the viral particles are in the salivary glands of the insect, and they spit up and suck up and spread the disease. That's when you get a lot of insects, like aphids and others, they can vector that. Thrips can do this too, and cause some real, real rapid spread because they can fly different places and spread it. All they got to do is suck a little bit up when they're drinking the plant juice, fly to another plant and spread it again. So many times in the case of some of these viruses, resistance is good, but sometimes controlling the insects can also reduce some of the mosaic viruses. All right, so viruses, that's a very short nutshell of viruses. There are a whole lot of different viruses that can cause issues with plants. All right, next we're going to move on to, are there any questions about any of that? Sorry. Stop a second. Okay, so next we're going to move on to nematodes. Nematodes, whatever you want to say it. These are animals. They're teeny tiny worms that cause some real trouble to roots many times in plants. They're generally microscopic, or very nearly so. And plant pathogenic nematodes have got this stylet. It's like a hypodermic syringe that goes backwards. It sucks the juice out of the plant in whichever part of it that they've kind of fed on. And they have a little pump here that sucks that out, pump that pumps the fluid out of the plant once they can pierce and penetrate the tissues of the roots. Mostly it's roots. This is a drawing of a nematode. This is a female nematode that has lots and lots of eggs. It has the ability to produce lots and lots of offspring. There's the stylet that sucks the juice of that plant. There's the basal knob and the muscular pump valve that, that basically is sucking plant juice and feeding this worm to have it grow. Then they produce lots and lots of offspring. But one key factor about them, they live in the soil in a matrix of kind of a wet film of water that lives on the soil. So you all have the soils part of that. They like living on that. The larger the soil particles, generally more different species of nematodes you can have on plants. We don't have quite as many nematodes here in the more clayey lands here. So that's one good thing for clay, is that it's harder for certain nematodes to cause problems. But in places where you have a lot of sandy soils, you can have root knot nematodes. That is basically, instead of having a nice network of nice fibrous roots, it's all these gnarly knots that you can see on sort of gall-like structures in the roots. And those plants don't have very good foundation or basis. This one in the foreground here has got root knot nematode, and it's causing the plant to be stunted, yellowing, just not getting good nutrient resources. That may not be a deficiency in nitrogen. It's basically because these roots just don't have a good way of absorbing nutrients. Patients also can have those root knot nematodes. Fortunately for us, that's not nearly as common here in the clay and silty soils as it is, say, along the coastal plain where all the sandy soils are. Now, let me go back there. This is a female nematode that's basically turned into a giant egg case, or a small egg case, but lots of eggs inside of it. Basically, the female will feed on it and then produce so many eggs that will overwinter. And then when it's time for that, that season to start up, they can pop out and go infest other roots. Sometimes you have some foliar nematodes. They're not very common or very common syndromes, but they can cause issues up in the canopy of the leaves. But mostly we're talking about root types of infecting worms. So there's a foliar nematode, but again, they're roundworms that are microscopic. You really would be hard pressed to see these with the naked eye. Sometimes they'll form these little nodules on the stems of some things like soybean cyst nematode that are pretty small, but that that's where some of those can. But basically, there's a bunch of those that feed on the roots of those plants. Okay, so that gets us to the cast of characters, these organisms that attack plants and cause them, set up feeding relationships, cause them to wilt or rot, or so many different types of things that we've seen that happen to plants. What I'd like to move on to next, though, is what do we do about it? What are some things that can be done to help control that? And there's a section that Extension puts down on plant disease control or management. Before I get to going any further, are there any questions about some of the organisms, the fungi, the bacteria, viruses, and nematodes? All right, I can't see if there's any questions, but I will. If anybody needs to take a break, we can do that too. Let me just see. Let me see if I can see the whole list of this. And so I don't see anybody needing to take a break. So I guess in interest of our time, we'll move along and go to the next section here. Plant disease control. This is, obviously there are many different ways to do this. Some of these are involved with using chemical controls. Others can be cultural controls. There's a variety of different techniques that can be done to help reduce diseases. And so we'll touch base on some of that. So with the control of insects as well as the control of diseases, there are several different kinds of tactics, controls that can be used with them. Some of those include what we call cultural, agricultural controls that don't necessarily require, spraying it with the chemical. Basically, that's using plant production practices that lessen the chance of disease. Sometimes that can mean making sure that the plant has the right amount of nutrients, making sure it's got a healthy start. Many times a healthy start with a plant gives this plant the ability to survive a potential disease in this case. So cultural controls, of course, chemical controls, we know about that. All you got to do is go to a home and garden center and find any number of fungicides or other types of things that can be used to control disease or lessen the issues of diseases. There are some biological controls that have been used, natural or modified organisms to lessen disease. Those tend to be somewhat rare, but they have worked in some cases. Then there's one that comes from the government or governments, and that is regulatory control. There's a whole series of laws, protocols, protections, and things like that that are set up by government agencies to try to prevent diseases from spreading. We found out how devastating it can be. And there's a whole network of folks that are actually trying to do that. The APHIS, Plant Protection and Quarantine folks, are right now at ports of call trying to prevent certain diseases from coming in, or insects, things like that. I worked with Plant Protection and Quarantine back when I first got out of college. And we were trying to identify insects, but folks are also working with that to help control diseases. There's a whole series of nursery inspectors and plant inspectors across the state of Tennessee. One of our recent graduates, Tim Robertson, is now one of those folks. But they're out looking for some of these things, in addition to folks like Carlo and folks like Katie who are looking for some of those. Anyway, but the process of trying to control the movement of plants or diseases to slow reduce the spread of that. And it's worked many times. We do not have that sudden death of oak in Tennessee because of plant inspectors who stopped it in their inspections. They were able to shut it down and control and sort of quarantine that particular disease. And then physical types of controls, that's another type. Using temperatures to try to control diseases, or various solar types of things. So again, let's go back to that plant disease triangle. You may hear this several times when you deal with plant disease, but again, susceptible hosts, virulent pathogen, favorable environment, all those three have to be together to cause a disease. But if we can target our management strategies at either reducing or increasing the strength of or resistance of the host, or attacking the pathogen, or reducing the pathogen's ability to feed on the plant, or altering the environment, say reducing irrigation so you don't have too much disease spread. if you can stop one or more of these things, you can stop the flow of a disease. Likewise, obviously, if you get each of these things together and they keep rolling, you can lose a whole bunch of plants. So the cultural side of this, as I mentioned, there are ways to reduce the spread of diseases or the buildup of diseases. And that is in this thing that is age old, but it's also new again. And that is rotation. A cultural practice is an agricultural practice. If you plant the same crop in the same place over again, year in, year out, the chances of getting the same kinds of fungi and diseases are pretty good. They can build up over time. Nematodes can build up over time, fungi, insects. But if you can rotate the families of plants from a given area, year in and year out, so legumes as one group, planting solanums the next, cucurbits, brassicas, or grass species. Many times we do a rotation of grass and legumes in the field crops. But rotation is something that's worked out by folks who learned this a long time ago and continues to work for many reasons. That's a cultural practice that can reduce the amount of pathogen.
Dr. Sugg,
Yes.
we've had a request if we could take a break around 7:30, just when you get to a good stopping point.
Okay. At 7:30. Okay, good. Gotcha. I can understand. This is a lot to deal with. Okay. Good. Okay, good. All right. So let's see. So we've got cultural practices we can control. Other cultural practices include buying seed from reputable sources. Sometimes if you save seed that is infected with a fungal pathogen, it's going to spread that to wherever you're going to plant it. Getting certified seed can be very important for a lot of things. You can purchase certified seed. They'll have a tag on it that says that. Inspecting plants before you purchase. If you go to a place where you're going to buy transplants, if they start looking like this has got some black rot of cabbage on it, you're going to get black rot in that patch of cabbages you plant. So looking them over ends up being important. Sometimes when plants are all grouped together, that can spread quickly. And so it's always good to do that for cultural practices. So others include controlling nearby neglected hosts. In this case, this black knot on plum really could stand a good pruning to reduce some of the impacts of that. Fire blight can sometimes be pruned out or culled. There's actually a culling that's going on in parts of Florida where there's citrus yellows that's occurring in citrus, and it's requiring them to take out infected hosts and burn them. So sometimes it's that extreme. Other times it may involve pruning or things like that. That's a cultural practice, agricultural types of practice, depending on the species. And avoiding and reducing pathogen. Now, some say that if you chop down all the cedar trees, we wouldn't have cedar apple rust. And that is kind of hard when you have towns around here called, Cedar Hill and other things like that. It's difficult to get rid of that. The big thing would be to try to get resistant varieties if you're going to try to stop that. But there are cultural methods that have been used in the past to do that. I don't know how practical that would be for here. Other cultural practices include roguing, pulling out, like this one is southern blight. The sclerotia on there, it's spreading. Get that thing out of the ground and take it away from these places where the infestations are so they don't spread to the rest of the plants. If you got rotten potatoes, it's a good idea not to put your coal piles near near where you're going to grow potatoes again. So there's a question I see in here that says, will plant disease happen if land is not given time to rest? That is sometimes what happens with certain cases, is one thing I can say. Around here, we have this problem in tobacco production where you get this black shank of tobacco, and if they plant the same field over and over again, there's a buildup of it. The same can be true for various other diseases that exist in the roots, that southern blight, for instance. If you plant the same thing over again, you basically provide ideal conditions for it to grow again. But if you change up the plant a different family entirely, many times that plant can avoid the pest, and that sort of thing. So rotations, back to rotations, it's a commonly practiced method to help reduce some of those diseases. But roguing is just kind of pulling out, removing diseased plants and taking them away and destroying them or keeping them from spreading to your crops. All right. So again, the regulatory inspections, I mentioned that already. Certification programs, making sure that it's certified seed or certified stock. Quarantines, if there's a disease, there's several diseases that we have. There's a plum pox that's up in parts of the Northeast that they have quarantined those orchards to keep it from spreading. Then, again, they can stop this at the nursery level, and that's why there are inspections of this. It's not just onerous government regulations, but ways for us to nip this stuff in the bud before it can spread and damage other industry. So cultural controls and regulatory practices, then biological control is something that can happen if you use certain organisms that are antagonistic to the disease-causing organisms. There's a type of fungus that actually eats nematodes. It makes these little lassos, catches the nematodes and kills them. Not very common, not very practical, but it's something that is one of the things that can happen. COVID caused any plant diseases? Not that I know of. This is an animal infecting virus. COVID is, it can transmit to other animals. There have been several animals in zoos that have died from it. Recently, there's an article in the Leaf Chronicle about COVID infecting deer populations, but that's not a plant infested thing. And whatever research is done on the internet, there's no scientific evidence that this is spread to plants. So thank you, Carl. So anyway, but now, biocontrols. There is a process of biocontrol with insects that's very common. We see lady beetles eating aphids, or spiders feeding on caterpillars, or things like this. Those are common. There are some organisms in the soil that will attack or suppress pathogens. There's a couple of types of fungi that can be used embedded in the soil to help suppress disease-causing fungi. Tends to be difficult and a little expensive, so it's not very commonly practiced, but it's still an option. Most are for soil-borne diseases and not foliar, and not super effective under most conditions when you have a lot of disease. So biocontrol is not very common, but physical methods are sometimes used. There are sometimes heat or steam sterilizations in greenhouse operations. You can get superheat the soil matrix that you're going to be using to sterilize it from having disease-causing organisms. Of course, that is probably also going to reduce any beneficial bacteria or fungi you're going to have in there too. So you might have to put your mycorrhizal fungi in there, things for rhizobial bacteria. Solarization is also a way to heat up soil to kill soil organisms. And this is something that can be done if you put clear plastic over soil at a certain time of the year, usually in the summer. So if you're going to grow a fall crop, you may be able to soil sterilize it with clear plastic. But it's, generally speaking, not a very common practice around here because it requires you not to grow the crop in the summer and at the time when you're sterilizing that soil. But these are a couple of physical methods that aren't super common. Well, the heating and steaming is commonly practiced, but not so much the solarization. Which leads us to chemical control, which is what most people ask when they have a disease. What do I spray? That sort of thing. And so, like I said, all those other control techniques may be options, but especially the cultural controls. And I didn't mention this, resistant varieties. Choosing resistant varieties is one of the most important cost-effective methods that we have of reducing diseases in plants. When you have further problems with these, though, sometimes you have to call in the firemen to control those if you've got a chemical control system. That includes fungicides, bactericides, and nematode killers or nematicides. As far as we know, there are no viricides that are used in plant disease control. These chemicals can be synthetic chemistries or natural. There are certain plant extracts that can be used to reduce some types of diseases. Things like neem seed oil is not only good for repelling insects, but can also suppress some plant pathogens. Key is you end up having to spray it after rain, things like that. Many times chemical control may not be adequate all by itself. If you combine it with some of these agronomic or cultural controls, reduce the amount of chemicals that you may have to spray and those sorts of things. Primarily, this is used as a foliar applied to the leaves, leaf surface area above ground, and then as seed treatments before planting. But sometimes you can do soil drenches, things like that for the roots and other things like that. But generally, it's best if you apply these before the infections occur. Once you have a full-blown infection, it's sometimes hard to stop that and turn it around and protect enough of a crop to keep the damage from being economic. So chemical control, there's a lot of different things, but we usually talk about fungicides and sometimes bactericides or antibiotics to either as protectants, as contact fungicides that protect the plant before the disease gets it, or systemics that can be used systemically through the plant to prevent the fungi from spreading and those sorts of things. Sometimes for plant disease control, we have to use insecticides. They found that when I was working with peanuts at Auburn, they found if you control the insect, you control the disease. The disease in that case was aflatoxin, which is pretty potent. You control the insect, you prevented the disease from spreading. The same is similar for aphids that bring viruses and things like that that attack these plants. So chemical controls are very commonly used, and insecticides can be part of that. So it is 7:30 now. We need to take the break before I go into the next side of that. Would we call a break at this point?
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a little break.
10 minutes. Yeah. All right.
I see War Eagle. Okay, all right. There we go. Okay, so all right. Well, let's take a little break. And when we come back, what do you want us to come back at, Carla? Like I can't hear you. 5 minutes or 10 minutes? What are we talking?
About 10.
10 minutes. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. All right, very good.
10 minutes. Good.
Okay, everybody can stretch. I'm going to stretch. I need to. Let's see. Let's stop share for a minute. Oops.
Okay, I think we are ready when you are.
All right, I will change my background here and go back to.
I don't know where your screen went, but
Uh-oh.
you're gonna have to share it again.
There we go. Okay, good. All right, everybody see me and hear me okay? Anybody not hear me or see me?
We can see you. I can't see your screen.
Okay, I'm gonna bring that back up again. So let's see where it is. So I got, how's that? Is that visible now?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, good. Okay, so go back one. So as I was mentioning, we were talking about some of the different controls. We talked about cultural controls, biocontrols, physical controls, regulatory controls, and then chemical controls. One of the things I did mention was ways to reduce the host susceptibility. We talked about that plant disease triangle. How can we prevent that or reduce this plant from being so susceptible and make it stronger and able to withstand diseases? Part of that is cultural. If you can balance the nutrition, proper pH with these plants, basically doing that soil test, making sure that you've got the right kind of pH for that crop can make all those nutrients available and give it at least a good, healthy, solid start so that it can withstand some of these attacks. There are many times plants are tolerating some kinds of fungal or bacterial infection if they're strong enough to be able to do it. Also making sure that there's enough drainage. It's not a real wet spot. That tends to be a big issue here. Get too much moisture in a certain place and it can spread or cause some of these pathogens to really get an advantage and kick, really hit your plants. Then also preventing water stress. That's another issue that plants, when they're dry out, they can be susceptible. And making sure other cultural requirements, producing healthy plants, making sure they got the right balance of nutrients, those sorts of things is always a good first start to allow, to make sure that you don't have to immediately go in and start spraying something. That can make a big difference. So, planting resistant varieties can really be an important thing. So those plants that have resistance factors built in, like verticillium resistance or other things like that in the seed packets, or any number of resistance options that you can get with various growing stock. This is an example where a foliar Phytophthora blight killed a bunch of petunias, but as you can see, the marigolds were not affected. That may be just specific to the species themselves. Sometimes it's just the actual resistant varieties that make a major difference. And so susceptible plants tend to need a lot of various types of protection when it comes to that. But choosing good resistant varieties is one of the first steps in plant pathology or plant disease control. Reducing host susceptibility. There are some types of chemicals or components that can be used with plants that can trigger active resistance to diseases. It's a thing called Actigard that helps plants. If you put that on the plant, it's not necessarily a chemical killing the actual pathogen, in this case a bacterial speck, but it's strengthening the defenses of the actual plant, because the plant has many times different plant defenses against the disease. Sometimes they're chemical, sometimes they're physical, but some of these can activate a protection in them. And sometimes those are primarily for commercial use. These can be somewhat expensive in some higher value crops, but there's a whole series of things in plant growth promoting rhizobacteria and other things like that. Some of my colleagues at Auburn were working on that back when I was there, and then those are now commercially available in some cases. Okay, so there are other ways to control. Sometimes they call them soft or biorational types of ways to do that. They can include a variety of different materials that can be used for controlling diseases. And these are things that may have been used a long time ago. There's a lot of different kinds of copper fungal control agents that are not necessarily synthetic chemical pesticides that are banned from certain crops. Certain biofungicides can be used, bicarbonates to some degree, various microbial inoculants can be purchased. Again, sometimes these are expensive things. Many times if I'm looking for these, I'll go down to a place like Gardens of Babylon in Nashville near the farmer's market, because they tend to have all of those, some of these rather unique and sometimes expensive control techniques. But some of these are available in various home and garden centers and co-ops and things like that, depending. There are a series of oils that can be used, plant extracts and resistance activators, and then types of pesticidal soaps or things like that. Many times those are killing the insects that are going to vector diseases. And sulfur has been used for a long time for plant disease control. And then you see streptomycin. That's something that we hear about in antibiotics. That's sometimes used in high value crops to control bacteria and things like that. These are things that can be used in sometimes even in organic types of production systems, as opposed to synthetic chemical fungicides like a whole series of chemical fungicides that we have. There's a lot of those. So anyway, soft disease, biorational is another term that I would use for that. So that's using some types of controls to go after, in this case, the actual fungi or strengthen the plant. Then other components are to make environment less favorable for disease. So allowing air and sunlight to penetrate through canopies sometimes can be a useful thing. Of course, I can bring weeds on, but allowing some airflow through orchards can make a big difference. You put an orchard down kind of at the bottoms of an area, many times that's where all the water, moisture, air, and fungi can combine and cause trouble with those plants. Distancing or spacing of the plants is another way of at least allowing airflow to happen in that case. Pruning off certain limbs and leaves, keeping things from getting too thick and tangled. That ends up being an issue when you have a lot of humidity in places. Making sure you have the right sun selection to make sure there's the proper sun exposure depending on it. And sometimes certain weed control can help reduce the potential spread of various pathogens in given areas. There's a whole series of weed species that are close to the plant species that you're trying to grow. If you can eliminate or reduce that issue, you may eliminate or reduce the disease spread between the two. Okay, so those are some things. Now, making the environment less favorable for disease includes making sure that you do proper irrigation practices. Not putting too much water on can make a big difference. Making sure you have the right sprinkler type or the methodology of getting the water to the canopy. Sometimes if you overspray onto leaf canopy, it can increase the chances of a fungal disease spreading on the leaves. Whereas if you water at the roots through a drip irrigation, you can sometimes reduce that foliar fungal spread. Not necessarily extending the natural wet period, making sure that you go at certain times of the day, depending upon what is the goal in trying to reduce the pathogen. Making sure there's good soil drainage can be really important for a lot of species to make sure those roots don't get rotten. That's a real important thing. Don't drown the roots either. I mean, if you have crops that sit underwater for a while, it's going to kill them off in many cases, unless you're trying to grow cypress trees or something like that. Avoiding low areas and soils with poor internal drainage can be important. We get those from time to time around. Producing raised beds has been kind of a common practice in gardening to allow for those plants to have a nice start, allow their roots to grow in a place that's aerated and not stay too wet. Conversely, you got to make sure they stay watered so they don't get too dry, because we get that happen too. And so making sure there's the proper soil amendments and those sorts of things to make sure that the water balance is proper in those situations. So those are some of many different kinds of techniques for controlling these some of these plant diseases. There are also some other additional considerations depending upon what type of plant. So in annual plants, emphasis is again on the crop rotation. If you're talking about trees that live for decades, you're not going to rotate them very rapidly. But in annual crops, you can rotate those plant families so you can reduce the buildup of certain diseases in different areas. In greenhouses, it's really about sanitation and keeping it from getting too humid to spread the diseases and things like that. One thing that they practice in places where you're trying to grow tomatoes or tobacco is not using tobacco products, because tobacco products sometimes have tobacco mosaic virus or things like that in it, and that can spread. Anybody who works in some of those tobacco or tomato greenhouses has to make sure they're not taking in tobacco products to spread virus. So sanitation is really important. For perennial plants, really, you're not going to cut the trees down every year. You're going to have to, if they're trees or shrubs, you're going to try to grow them, but pruning them can make a big difference. Certainly pruning out infected parts of the plant or galls and things like that. And then cleaning the cutting materials, the pruning implements and things like that. But you're removing the source of inoculum, providing air circulation through the canopy, and allowing better spray penetration if you're going to use sprays. So those are a few different factors that are involved in plant disease control. All right, so wow, we got through a bunch of things. Now there's one other section they talk about nematode control. This tends to be perhaps a little more statewide in some of the sandier areas, but with nematode control, resistant varieties can make a big difference. Sometimes you will find plants that are RKN resistant, root knot nematode resistant. But sanitation practices are very important to make sure that equipment doesn't pass on any type of pathogen, including nematodes. Rotating crops, solarization, fallowing. Now, in some places, they will use African marigolds to keep nematodes out of various gardens. This is commonly talked about in much of, in certain types of organic literatures and things like that. The key is that's going to be pretty much on a small scale basis, but they do exude a type of chemistry that can suppress certain soil organisms. Composting green manure. So those are some things with nematode control, but we don't tend to have a big issue with nematodes here unless you go to some of the sandier soils. It's not as big an issue. All right, so that kind of covers a bunch of the plant disease control. Now, one of the things that we want to make sure that we're considering is, I've showed a lot of things here, way too many things for any one person to grasp in a short amount of time. I wanted to give a coverage of the kinds of variety of these things. But how do you know? And I have to say, it's not easy. After years of plant pathology training, I can't always diagnose, what certain symptoms are. It could be a combination of things, or it could be one or another thing. But in order to get at least a stab at this, we have to kind of act like a detective. One of the very first things we have to do is, what's the victim? And so the plant, the host that's susceptible, what kind of plant? If you know the type of plant that it is, many times there's only certain diseases that can actually attack it. And so that can limit what potential diseases, kind of eliminate some of the ones that it could be. What do the symptoms look like? Knowing that. What's the pattern? How it's distributed in planting? Those sorts of things. Is it a low area where there's a lot of water? Is it a bad soil type for that? When was this planted? What chemicals were used? What were the weather conditions been like? It's a whole series of things that folks in plant disease control will use in this process to try to diagnose what the issue is. I have to say, even the best diagnosticians down in Nashville, Carla Keene, have to many times look up several different sources in order to get at least an idea of what the disease is. And because it's always different. Sometimes you start out with the initial phases of infestation, and it may not be fully, show itself fully until a little bit later. And so there are different ways to do that. Sometimes the folks at the plant pest center down in Nashville have to get the specimen and culture out whatever it is, whatever fungal disease this might be, or on a culture plates, in order to really know what the causal organism is. First, again, is ID the plant, so you can eliminate the possibilities. So knowing what the plant is very important. It's not always easy when you have a lot of different varieties in a landscape, but many times if you plant a crop, you know what that crop is. Again, if it's a cherry tree, then it's not going to be cedar apple rust. You know, that's a way to eliminate that potential thing. Consider common problems for that type of plants. You know, in many ways, trying to keep it simple is one of the first ways to look at it. Many of the diagnoses will be made that way. So leaf spots on Photinia are many times entomosporium. Generally speaking, there are certain things that repeat themselves. And I have to say, Carla is a wealth of knowledge on the kinds of diseases that hit so many different kinds of plants in this area at different times of the year. And so you have one of the best experiential plant pathologists in this area in Carla, because she knows just about all that there's going to be. And if not, she's got a hotline down to Nashville to plant pathologists there. As far as diagnosing, again, check for mites, scale insects, and other insects, because sometimes the syndrome may be an insect issue. You've all had the insect section already. Sometimes it's these little tiny mites. Sometimes you need a hand lens to see those, or scale insects, or aphids, or other things like that may actually be causing that wilt on that plant. Looking closely can make a big difference. It may not be a plant disease at all. Or it could be insects that are vectoring plant disease in that case. Trying to consider all known types of diseases for a type of plant. There are a lot of different sites that have information about diseases and their complexes. UT's got some sites that have that. Other UK also has some of those. Auburn has some. Depending on where you are, you want to look at in some of the areas that you're located as to, you know, it's not going to be necessarily something that would be in the tropics, you know, if it's here in Tennessee. There are a lot of different books, compendia of disease control, that you can look them up to describe these diseases that can help. Many times I go back to the internet if I'm looking at some of these symptoms, because there's so many types of things that you can find that that have valuable information about plant diseases. Most of the time I see them with their websites as having an edu at the end of them. You know, it's basically something that has been documented and studied scientifically and those sort of things, or org tends to be that way. And there's some good ones in the .com section too, and then some that are, you know, variable depending on that. But there are a lot of different websites that are available for plant disease symptoms. Also important is to observe the symptomatology, the pattern of this disease on there. Is it uniformly distributed through most of the plants of that type, or is it spotty? You know, there are ways to look at where these infestations have occurred. If that's a uniform distribution, it's probably not a soil-borne problem. They're scatter localized. Sometimes it can be a soil-borne problem. Sometimes that may be some of the first steps to look at when you're looking at what kind of potential issue is causing a problem with your plants. Looking at soil drainage, I've probably said this many times, making sure there's not too much water in a low area to cause this issue. Many times we see that with root rots or other types of things. There are many folks that can use a soil perk test to see how well the soil drains in certain areas. Many times you usually know if it's a place that retains water a bunch. Is it getting a lot of runoff, et cetera? Where's the source of this? What irrigation practices have been used? You know, it's a regularly irrigated place. Sometimes it's over. Sometimes you have these turf systems or lawn systems that will water regardless of whether it's rained or not. And when you do that, sometimes you run. First off, you're wasting water. Secondly, you can have this issue of a buildup of conditions to spread, you know, soil-borne diseases and things like that. So knowing about that can also be part of the diagnostic process. And when was it planted? You know, was this a late planted crop? You know, sometimes that can lead to certain types of diseases, or early planted, depending on what it is. What chemicals were used on it? How much fertilizer or lack thereof was there? What the soil pH? You know, those sort of things. Those can be important factors in helping to diagnosis. Looking at the weather conditions, was it rainy, dry, hot, cold, depending on what it is, there are different kinds of weather conditions. This last year, we had certain types of dry periods that sparked the spread of armyworm and armyworms into grass and turf and things like that. It's usually very rare, except when you get a certain type of dry period, a certain type of the season. There's similarities in the plant disease side of this. Most diagnoses are made by matching all of this preceding information with the symptoms that you're seeing. Even at the lab, so again, for more information, as I mentioned, you have a great resource in Carla in being able to do that. Now, I'm not trying to give her extra work, but getting digital images is so much more common these days than it used to be. We usually have a way to get a really good image of what that disease is. Some folks even have these little lenses that help, macro lenses that help give some good close-up images of some of the plants. And so, Carla's really, usually she knows what most of the things that are going to come across the net to her. But even if she doesn't, she can't make a diagnosis. There are specialists at the diagnostic lab. UT has that lab down in Nashville. UK has one up in Princeton for Kentucky. The specialist will ask that you not necessarily send them by email. I think there's a process, right, Carla, that they get digital images to them.
Yes, it's not open to the public. So yeah, you've got to have an account. So you have to go through your extension agent to use the distance diagnostics.
Because they're getting stuff from all over the state. Many times they're getting specimens that are from heavily infested types of things that they're able to culture out and figure out. But there are things that stump Carla. This can happen. There's a lot of things that stump me, but Carla really has a wealth of knowledge about many of these diseases in this area.
Thank you for your confidence. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, it's true. I mean, many times, this many times when it comes to, and then there are times when it just stumps everybody. Even, the diagnosticians have trouble figuring out until they plate the thing out. Sometimes you have to take the fungus, plate it on a culture media, grow it out, and then reinfest the plant to make sure that it's got Koch's-proof postulates for pathogenicity, to know that it's actually the pathogenic organism. So there are times when that's required. Usually there's not enough time to go through for that, but there's a lot of different ways to help with the diagnosis. All right, so that's actually shorter. I'd shortened that at the end there. I think I may have truncated. That's still way too many slides. And sorry to have to rifle through them so quickly, but I wanted to make sure that we had some time for any kind of questions that there might be. And I say questions, I say for me and for Carla in this case. So who's got the first question? Everybody's ready to check out Tuesday. This is their last. This is your last class. This may be your last.
This is the last class. Yeah, I think they're anxious to go home. We're pretty quiet here.
I think I gave Carla the PDF for this. Is that one going to be available, or are they going to use them? Okay.
I will post that on our Google Drive. I usually post it after the presentation. So.
Oh, I've got a question from the chat. And it's, what do you think about diatomaceous earth? And I can say that diatomaceous earth has been used for a variety of different types of insect controls and other nematode controls from time to time, for its nature of having all those little fine fossil shell-like structures that scratch the insect's outer surface or the nematode's outer surface to help it, to cause it to dry out. Many times that's what's causing the insect issue. I'm not as familiar with using diatomaceous earth for plant disease control. Have you heard about that, Carla?
No, it's more on insects. Usually keep slugs and snails and other soft-bodied insects away from your plants. I don't know that it's used for plant diseases myself.
It does have an abrasive factor to the surfaces of plant leaves, the waxy cuticle layer of the plants, and sometimes can cause some kinds of abrasions, if it's scratched too much. But mostly, that's something that can be used in a organic types of production systems for insects.
Okay, and she's following up with, can it be used on edibles? As far as I know, it can. I mean, any of your foods, that you bring in from the garden, just remember to wash them. Anything like that, you're going to want to remove the dirt, the debris, the bugs.
The bird poop.
Plant. Yeah, get rid of the bug poop.
Bird poop off the leaves.
Are plants grown for medicinal purposes susceptible to plant diseases? Yes. Yes. I know the first year that we were growing hemp and just learning about that as medical use, a lot of new diseases came in. And so that was kind of an interesting couple of years for me anyway, on the new diseases that go along with that. But herbs, they all plants will have some kind of a specific insect or disease that can attack it. So just
each one does. Now, sometimes medicinal plants, many times they're selected because of their chemical capacities. Some of these plants have, over the millions of years, developed chemical defenses against insects or diseases that make them kind of valuable for medicinal or herbal uses or those sorts of things. And I'm talking, there's many things, even like parsley has its own protective powers and those sort of things. And we like the taste of it in food, but those are, that parsley family has some potent chemistries, sometimes toxic in things like water hemlock and things like that. Solanaceae, the group that has the tomatoes, potatoes, and others have, we don't eat tomato leaves because they're potent. Potato leaves will make you sick. You don't really eat tobacco leaves either because they're very, very potent and powerful. Certain plants have very strong chemistries, and yet each of them have their own pests that picked the lock and found a way to feed on them and damage them. I know of a bunch of specialist insects that feed on each of these types of crops.
Okay, and Amanda wants to know if there are any social media pages that you recommend following for passive learning on this or related topics.
Social media pages, I'm not as familiar with. I haven't been keeping up with that myself for social media pages. There are a number of university-based websites that talk about many of these kinds of plant pathology or plant diseases, things that I tend to have my students go to. There are places you can go to ask questions about what's bothering my plant and those sorts of things. And I've seen several of them. Sometimes it's really, really good, useful information. Sometimes it's a combination of things. I tend to stick with some of the university extension types of publications when it comes to that sort of system, just because there's a whole level of scientific research behind the answers that come from those.
And there is a page for Tennessee Extension Master Gardeners. It's for the whole state. So it's MG Master Gardener Discussion, I believe is what it's called on Facebook. So I do like to follow that, and I try to answer questions online too, especially if I'm dealing with master gardeners and they go in throwing home remedies. They're going to get a little note, that says that's not research-based information, and that's what we're supposed to be giving out. Because if you go to some of the sites, you'll hear some pretty wild things, So be careful and look for university-based, research-based information.
I don't want to discount
your local extension agent. That's what we're here for.
And I don't want to discount folk wisdoms and things like that that have come from grandparents on down. There are certain things that may work. It's just that without the kind of rigorous scientific testing of these things, many times it's just anecdotal or conjecture. And that's the basis of it, the scientific method and the process of that. It ends up being important for so many things. There are consequences to just kind of coming up with your own sort of research on the internet because having scientific studies behind them are a way to guarantee there's a difference from just chance.
Okay. All right. Well, very good. Are there any?
So one thing I want to do just again is to leave, I'm going to set this up to the front here. I'm going to just give you some of my contact info. That's my email, Sudbrink. Can everybody pull this up for large screen? Let's see, how to do that. Trying to display it. Anyway, my email is sudbrinkd@apsu.edu. For those interested in Austin Peay agriculture, any of those things, or any of these courses that are going to be taught. Plant pathology, I'll do that in the spring. I'll do weed science next fall. And some of the other classes will be taught periodically over that frame. Also, those interested, we do have a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, and you can focus in agri-science and get a whole bunch of these types of topics if you're interested. I'll be glad to let you know more if you want to contact me by email.
Good deal. Good deal. All right. Well, with no other questions, I think we'll go. Just to our class, I want to thank you for participating in these last 13 weeks. I think we've done good on our face-to-face and our hybrid Zoom here. It's been a little different these last couple of years. You'll probably be hearing, you will be hearing from me through email. I did put the link up for the end of the year survey, the evaluation. So if y'all can click on that link and take that, it just 5 or 10 minutes. It doesn't take long to do it. Do that for me. And then I will be sending out information about the December 9th. I believe it's December 9th. We will have the awards banquet and recognition at the Civic Hall at 6 o'clock. So you will be receiving information about that. So, all righty. Thank you all, and everybody have a good Thanksgiving, and we will see you on another day.
All righty. Take care. Thanks again.
All right, bye.
Good luck, Master Gardeners. You are now deputized to look after all these pests and things and report them. You're the eyes and ears of everybody out here. So thanks
Y'all
again.
been deputized. That's an interesting idea. I might have to get them a neat badge. So. All right. Thank you.
When are you going to post this recording? When are you going to post this recording?
I can't hear.
When are you going to post
We'll
this
send out
recording?
the Google link is always in the email that I send you each week with the link for the class.
Okay, because I'm
whole
first off,
thing.
I couldn't hear none of it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure who's talking.